I'm thinking that since our aim here, dear students, is a close reading of Tristram Shandy rather than a quick inspection, some generalities, and on to the next, that perhaps we should dwell together in my expensively acquired British accent. Actually, that's not true. It cost me nothing. But I was obliged, first of all, to exercise the English tongue here in America for the first 9 years of my life, and then to purify what I must have acquired as a first California and then New York accent, to purify it in the waters of a British boarding school education, which is what brings us to here, the life and opinions of Tristram Shandy Gent, ignoring the dedication to Mr. Pitt. There's another dedication that follows later on, which makes us aware of how mocking these pseudo-dedications are. But once it gets going, he tells us, I wish either my father or my mother, or indeed both of them, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, had minded what they were about when they begot me. Had they duly considered how much depended upon what they were then doing, that not only the production of a rational being was concerned in it, but that possibly the happy formation and temperature of his body, perhaps his genius and the very cast of his mind, and, for aught they knew to the contrary, even the fortunes of his whole house, might take their turn from the humours and dispositions which were then uppermost. This is at the moment of Tristram's conception. Had they duly weighed and considered all this and proceeded accordingly, I am very verily persuaded that I would have cut a very different figure in the world from that in which the reader is likely to see me. Believe me, good folks, this is not so inconsiderable a thing as many of you may think it. You have all, I dare say, heard of the animal spirits, as how they are transfused from father to son, etc., etc., and a great deal to that purpose. Well, you may take my word that 9 parts in 10 of a man's sense, or his nonsense, his successes and miscarriages in this world, depend upon their motions and activity. This is the animal spirits. And the different tracks and trains you put them into, so that when they are once set a-going, whether right or wrong, 'tis not a halfpenny matter. Away they go, cluttering like hey go mad, and by treading the same steps over and over again they presently make a road of it, as plain and as smooth as a garden walk, which, when they are once used to it, the devil himself shall sometimes not be able to drive them off it. Pray, my dear, quoth my mother, have you not forgot to wind up the clock? Ah! Cried my father, making an exclamation, but taking care to moderate his voice at the same time. Did ever woman, since the creation of the world, interrupt a man with such a silly question? Pray, what was your father saying? Nothing. And Sterne goes on to describe the essential element. He's describing a sperm now, the crucial sperm, the sperm that made him, the homunculus, this tiny being that was supposed to reside in each sperm, a miniature man, a homunculus. In however low and ludicrous a light he may appear, in this age of levity to the eye of folly or prejudice, to the eye of reason in scientific research, he stands, confessed, a being, guarded and circumscribed with rights, the minutest philosophers, who, by the by, have the most enlarged understandings, their souls being inversely as their inquiries, show us incontestably that the homunculus is created by the same hand, engendered in the same course of nature, endowed with the same locomotive powers and faculties with us, that he consists, as we do, of skin, hair, fat, flesh, veins, arteries, ligaments, nerves, cartilages, bones, marrow, brains, glands, genitals, humours, and articulations, is a being of as much activity, and in all senses of the word as much as truly our fellow creature as my Lord Chancellor of England. He may be benefited, he may be injured, he may obtain redress. In a word, he has all the claims and rights of humanity, which Tully, Cicero, Puffendorf, or the best ethic writers allow to rise out of that state and relation. Now, dear sir, what if any accident had befallen him in his way alone, or that through terror of it, natural to so young a traveller? This is the man in the sperm. My little gentleman, the homunculus, had got to his journey's end miserably spent, his muscular strength and virility worn down to a thread, his own animal spirits ruffled beyond description, and that in this sad disordered state of nerves he had laid down a prey to sudden starts or to a series of melancholy dreams and fancies for 9 long, long months together. I tremble to think what a foundation had been laid for 1,000 weaknesses, both of body and mind, which no skill of the physician or the philosopher could ever afterwards have set thoroughly to rights. So this is the beginning of Tristram Shandy's defence. Please, if it please the court, I never stood a chance. The sperm that created me was interrupted by my mother, much as Sterne's novel is a continuous coitus interruptus, which he interrupts himself. He then proceeds to tell us the role that this story played. To my uncle, Mr. Toby Shandy, do I stand indebted for the preceding anecdote, the story of Did You Remember to Wind the Clock, which is something that, as you'll know from reading onwards, Tristram's father liked to do once a month to make sure he got it done, and that applied also to his marital duties, so that his poor wife, Tristram's mother, when she heard the winding of the clock, great huge grandfather clock, knew what was coming, knew what to anticipate. That would be his day, his hour for the conjugal mating. This anecdote, to whom my father, Mr. Toby Shandy, Uncle Toby, to whom my father, who was an excellent natural philosopher and much given to close reasoning upon the smallest matters, had often heavily complained of the injury, but once more particularly as my Uncle Toby well remembered upon his observing a most unaccountable obliquity, as he called it, in my manner of setting up my top and justifying the principles upon which I had done it. This is as a child, playing with a top. The old gentleman shook his head, and in a tone more expressive by half of sorrow than reproach, he said, his heart all along foreboded. This is Tristram's dad, Walter. And he saw it verified in this, that from 1,000 other observations he had made upon me, that I should neither think nor act like any other man's child. But alas, continued he, shaking his head a second time and wiping away a tear which was trickling down his cheeks, my Tristram's misfortunes began 9 months before he ever came into the world. And my mother, who was sitting by, looked up, but she knew no more than her backside what my father meant. But my uncle, Mr. Toby Shandy, who had been often informed of the affair, of the disaster of Walter being interrupted at the key moment, at le moment propice, the French say, the propitious moment. What a catastrophe it was that his wife had asked him if he'd remembered to wind the clock, just as he was about to deliver himself of little Tristram. This is my uncle, understood him very well, because Walter had so often told the story of his misconception, his missed conception, his botched conception, which had left him the little homunculus who was his guide, I suppose, his introduction to the world inside the sperm, who was terribly distressed by the sudden interruption of his movement into the womb to create the storyteller. So that's our first intimation, I think it's fair to say, of what will be one of the great themes of this book, which is interruption. This book dwells in interruption, shamelessly, interrupts itself all the time, sometimes doesn't come back at all to where it left off, sometimes omits entire chapters, which then return in the wrong place when properly remembered, and altogether is an insult to the very idea of continuity, the very idea of coherence in the universe. So this is either very congenial to you because you have always thought that the universe was a very broken place, or else it's infuriating because you come to information seeking knowledge, and to knowledge seeking wisdom, and you see the three as an interlocking chain in which incoherent information is hardly going to yield coherent knowledge, and incoherent knowledge is never going to yield wisdom. Those three things on which you might think life depends. The fact is that people acquire knowledge even without information, their knowledge being based on dreams, on guesswork, on devout belief in what they're being told, even though it contains very little information. And on this knowledge, which usually we regard as meditated information, out of this knowledge is born wisdom, which usually we regard as meditated knowledge. But it assumes a certain streamlined progress through these three in order to reach, if it ever can, that thing called wisdom. So when you come across a book like this, you're perhaps frustrated in your hopes that education will, and discovery of the supposed wonders of the classics will set you on that path successfully. And so you regard this man Stern as the high priest of confusion, of frustration, and the very devil himself as regards your ability to reach the higher planes of wisdom. Or you will be gratified to think that generation upon generation have embraced the concept of dislocation and dismemberment as being a truer account of life as you've experienced it than any smoothly consonant philosophy. Or you may discover for the first time, having always thought that wisdom was there at the end of the tracks, waiting for you if you could only climb onto the caboose of information and moved forwards through the compartments of knowledge. You would arrive at the great steam engine of wisdom, but having thought that, perhaps it could be. You will realize when you read Tristram Shandy that there is no such journey. It's a delusion, and that the joy of life is best summed up by an amusing tale which has no beginning, no proper beginning, and no end, and just a lot of wildly humorous parts. Shandy, in fact, the name Shandy, which came to mean a mixture of ginger beer and beer, didn't mean any such thing in Stern's time. It was a word for wild or unruly. So in Shandy Hall, Tristram's home, in the wild house of unruliness, this story is born. speak again soon. It's always my pleasure to picture you there. Bye now.